Our next storyteller, Kyra Davis, is coming up, and she has a beautiful coming-of-age story. And I guarantee you that it will be the weirdest birds and the bees story that you have ever heard. Come on up.
So last month, I was in Las Vegas for the very first time with a couple friends celebrating my birthday. And it was kind of an unusual trip, and I decided that I didn't want to do Vegas the typical way. I didn't want to do the clubs. I actually didn't see any shows. I didn't have a drink. But the one thing that was actually really quite important to me was to get to see the Grand Canyon for the first time. And so we scheduled a helicopter tour to see the Grand Canyon at sunset. And before we boarded the helicopter, I called my dad and said, thank you. Thank you for inspiring me to see the Grand Canyon. As it happens, 20 years before, almost to the month, my father and I had gone on a grand adventure to see the Grand Canyon for the first time. I had landed in Scottsdale. I was living with my mother in California and flew to Scottsdale to see my aunt. My father, who was living in Connecticut, had driven from Connecticut to Scottsdale to meet me there. My father had like a rule of thumb that if you calculated the price of a plane ticket and the cost of gas, that you always chose the cheaper one, even if that meant driving across the country. So he drove, and we met in Scottsdale and spent some time with my family, and then embarked on our own adventure to go to the Grand Canyon. So we packed up the car and got on Route 66 and headed that way. A couple things here. My father has a real love of Saabs that are on the verge of collapse, for lack of a better word. They drive, but the air conditioning doesn't work in hot Scottsdale. The heat doesn't work when you get to the Grand Canyon. The windows don't roll down. There is no radio. There is no relief. The speedometer doesn't even work, so you're just basically like winging it, going down the freeway. And so we're hurtling in this piece of metal, towards the Grand Canyon, and we get close by, and it's getting close to dark. And my father, we realized that we're not going to be able to make it to the camp that day, so we probably need to spend the night. And so we decide to camp. And my father's version of camping is kind of alternative. So we're driving along the road, and essentially what you do is you pull perpendicular to the road and drive for 3 miles through the forest, and then you pitch a tent. And so that's what we did in the dark, drove through the forest and pitched a tent. And there was a small detail that I hadn't told my father because I was 10 years old and this was spring break and I didn't want to have this conversation with my dad, which was that I was having one of my first periods. And I was 10 and not really skilled at having a period in a bathroom with lights and a trash can and showers and it was still kind of a mess. But then you put me in the dark in the Grand Canyon without a bathroom and no flashlight and no trash can, and it's a serious mess. So, and I'm just kind of being with that as we're going to bed, and I have this inkling that I'm should I tell my dad that maybe we should just get a hotel room tonight? And then I don't. My father's somebody who he prides himself in not really having needs or being able to live on the fringes of other things. And so I had this moment where I'm well, I'm not really allowed to have a need here. In any case, in that vein, my father also doesn't really plan ahead, and so we had stale trail mix, which was dinner, and I ate some, and I was still really hungry, and went to bed crampy and hungry and upset, and that was night one. And so we wake up in April, and it did something kind of unusual, which was we woke up in a foot of snow and a pool of blood, and my father, just kind of like pokes around the tent and it's like, oh, it's actually a pretty serious snowstorm. Like we are not going to be able to make it to the Grand Canyon today. So, we could go to a library. My father thinks library because it's a free, public, warm space that has that has entertainment, books, and magazines, and periodicals, and that kind of thing. And then, go camping again in the snow without a bathroom, anyway. The next night, and then see if we can see the Grand Canyon the next day. And at this point, I lose my shit. Like, it was like, put my foot down, this is the end, full tears, and the emphatic, we are going home right now. There are no two ways about it. Take me home, I'm going home. And home, at this point, is Scottsdale. So we pack up our tent, get it back in the car, pile into this little Saab, take this Saab the 3 miles towards the road, through the forest, get back on Route 66, and the car goes from the very cold in the Grand Canyon to getting increasingly hot as we're getting through the desert, much like here. And I think it's in this moment, because I've been hiding the fact that I've had my period, although, I don't know how good I was at hiding it, but I think it dawns on my father that maybe the reason I'm losing my shit is because I'm hormonal. And so in this moment, I think he has this like, oh, if she's hormonal, I better have the birds and the bees conversation with her right now. And so I don't have any children. I have not yet had the pleasure of delivering this conversation. But I think that there's a few ways you can do it, right? There's two people who love each other very much. There's a sperm and an egg. There's a penis and a vagina. There's two penises. There's two vaginas. There's things that you need to protect against. There's STIs and unintended pregnancies and people who break your heart and some real guidelines. You need some architecture to hang knowledge on, and then you need some wisdom to kind of tuck it all in. And instead we started somewhere else entirely. So my father is driving down Route 66 and it has gone to the very, very hot and the windows will not roll down, and I am just trying to think of things other than being in the car till we get home. And so my father is looking out at the road and he says, so, Kyra, when you're in college and you start having sex, you may be very tempted to reuse condoms. I urge you not to do this. I will always buy you condoms. At this point, I don't know what a condom is, where you put it, why you use it, why you would never, ever, ever want to reuse it. There's a lot of things that I don't understand about this situation, but it is deeply, deeply uncomfortable to me. And I remember eyeing the car door handle and just kind of looking at if I open this door and just start rolling out, will this make it better? And the back of the envelope calculations were no, but it was close. And this was one of those conversations, too, that in the decades since this conversation, it's only gotten weirder. Since I understood what a condom was, and I've seen a used condom at least once, it's only gotten weirder in that I now have this very uncomfortable window into my father's sexual psychology about what he was dealing with when he was in college and having sex and the things that he couldn't stop thinking about that I think that most daughters just don't really get to have that kind of depth of insight. So in any case, we do in fact make it home back to Scottsdale. I see my aunt I pass her a plastic bag of bloody clothing. It looks like I've like killed a small animal and brought it back from the Grand Canyon, and I'm like just like delivering it to her like a cat who's like delivering like a small gerbil or something. She puts me in the bathtub and holds me while I cry. And for that moment, everything was kind of like restored to being okay, that I had someone who was going to be there and take care of me and listen to my needs. There is some like lasting impacts of this trip. I've never reused a condom, not even once. I didn't camp for 17 years. I avoided road trips, and until, it took me 2 decades to actually see the Grand Canyon. I tell this story a lot to my loved ones to explain my relationship with my father, because I think I don't really have a better way to tell this story. My father is a very complex character. He is deeply loving, fierce in his love, and has some unusual characteristics. He is somebody who lives at the fringes of other people's material reality. He drives cars that other people won't drive. He wears clothes that other people have already worn and deemed unfit to wear. He eats foods that are basically the same. And so as a child, it was really hard for me because he wasn't allowed to have needs, and so it felt like I wasn't allowed to burden him with my needs. But underneath that, he's a man who just deeply loved me very much. He wanted to show me the beauty of the world. He wanted to take me to the Grand Canyon. He wanted to protect me against the hardships of things like STIs and unintended pregnancies. And so I think what this is a coming of age story in 2 parts. First, when I am going into the Grand Canyon and becoming a woman and bleeding for one of the first times. But the second was making that call on the tarmac to my father to say thank you, and to tell him that I understand that he's loving me the best way that he knows how, and to remind myself that I know how to love him the best way that I know how. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to say it after every speaker because it's all going to be amazing.